Good evening. I'd like to welcome everyone to the work session tonight for the Portsmouth Planning Board for March 22nd, 2012. We have one item on the agenda. That is the zoning amendments for downtown parking. Having read that in, I'd like to turn it over to the Deputy City Manager, Cindy Hayden.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to give a brief presentation on kind of the big picture that the City Council and multiple other boards will be looking at over the ensuing months. As you know, parking downtown has been a big issue under discussion by a lot of different boards in the Council for quite some time now, and I think we're ready to break that log jam and move ahead. I think everybody knows we had Nelson Nygaard do the study of supply and parking availability, parking demand downtown, and I know a number of you came to at least one of their presentations late last year, and Rick is going to also give a brief presentation to just hit the highlights of their report. So part of the big picture process that the Council is doing is shown in this little process slide, and you have it in front of you. It's the bottom half of your top page there in your handout. And we don't need to worry a lot about this as the planning board, but I want people to understand really the big picture. And that is at the top of the screen on March 12th, the City Council had a work session where it discussed guiding parking principles, which are really meant to be kind of the overarching framework for how we're going to go about regulatory changes, pricing changes, parking garage, just a way to kind of have a cohesive approach. And at their March 19th City Council meeting, they voted on and adopted those guiding parking principles. I'm going to run through those. The most important little boxes up here for us are on the right-hand side. This is really the regulatory recommendations that planning staff is going to work with the planning board to bring through relative to parking requirements downtown and the payment of lieu and in lieu of fee, and we'll get into that a little bit more. And the second box down is where we are tonight, March 22nd. I won't talk too much about here, but this is sort of the pricing and supply and garage issues on the left-hand side that the Economic Development Commission, the Parking, Traffic, and Safety Committee are going to be working on. And so all of these things will feed back into the City Council, both from the left on the pricing issues and the garage issues, and on the right from the Planning Board, the regulatory issues. City Council will hold a work session to discuss the draft recommendations coming out of both sides of the aisle here. And then the intent is that we'd have a parking omnibus where all these regulatory changes, pricing changes, possible garage are brought together, and they'll just march right through first, second, and third reading at City Council. And then running right next to that, parallel to that, would be the bonding for public parking garage, if that's one of the recommendations that comes out of this process. So I think it's a good approach that City Council's taking the lead here and really put together this process along with the city manager on how we're going to march forward. So we're an important part of that process. And just going to go quickly through some of the things that we discussed with the City Council in recent weeks. And when the staff was putting together the guiding principles for parking, one thing that we thought is really helpful about the conversation is to understand the difference between parking supply and parking management issues. And quite simply, supply is, gee, we don't have enough parking, we need to build more, somebody needs to build more, versus management, which is really about optimizing what we've got, either through changes in on-street time limits or changes in pricing in the garage or on-street, or a different approach to wayfinding to get to parking. And then these two overarching principles really are key. I know the planning board feels strongly, and the council does, that we really want to have a mix of uses downtown. We want restaurants, retail, offices, residential. And the second item up here is really in order to have that healthy, vital downtown with mixed uses, we need a convenient supply of parking that's easy to get to and makes people want to park downtown and stay. And there are 17 guiding parking principles. These, for this board, are the most important because these are about the zoning changes. The first one is that is just making a statement. Parking for our non-residential downtown users is a city responsibility. Number two is that parking for downtown new residences is a responsibility to be built on site by the residences, basically, because people want to park where they live. And we'll get into the details of these general goals in a few minutes with Rick's presentation. And these others, some of them apply to parking, apply to the planning board, but we'll talk about them briefly. And really, this one just says we need to plan for downtown redevelopment and reuse. We've got vacancies rates there now. We've got some vacant parcels there, so we need to be thinking about how those are going to develop, and we need to provide parking that supports that so that people coming to town don't get frustrated, can't find a parking space, and they say, well, I'll go to Dover for dinner. Same with offices. I'll locate my office somewhere else. The next principle adopted by the City Council is that really the city should play the lead role here with regard to parking, and that we should have a broad brush approach to it, a unified, comprehensive approach to the parking system. And the second bullet under there is that the council recognizes that private parking is very important, but we also know that it's not within the city's control and it's not something long-term that we can count on. So there are some underutilized private lots, but they're not going to be guaranteed to fill the bill. Next one is that we need to manage parking to address those peak period times, those Fridays and Saturday nights when people can't find parking. For example, and it's just one example, through special pricing at the garage. I think everybody knows for the fireworks and Children's Day, we do a flat rate fee. The sixth principle adopted by the council is that the garage should support economic development for all those offices, retail, residential. It should support the visitors and customers that want to come to those non-residential uses, and it should support residents. And we need to price it and manage it so we best utilize it and improve utilization. This next one is pretty simple. Pricing should be simple and easy to use, not confusing to customers and residents. Number 8, we need to just be aware that there's a difference between people who want to run into town for a quick errand, those short-term parkers, and they might want to stay for 15 minutes or a couple hours, and then long-term parkers who want to come work there for the day and just park and be there for the day or possibly even overnight. This principle has to do with pricing and managing the more desirable parking spaces where everybody seems to want to park. Look at pricing those at a little bit higher rate, and recognizing, why send people away after 2 hours when the meter runs out? Let them stay and pay if that's what they want to do, and spend more time downtown. Number 10, we should make information on how you can park and where you can park easy to use, and use technology to get that information out. 11, as we've talked about a little already, we should take a big picture approach to parking planning in all of our decision making, and I think that's exactly what the council is doing by adopting these principles. And this is one that I think is important to the planning board, the planning board realizes the importance of, which is that all of our parking resources should be concerned about aesthetics and security and be accessible and have user information that's easy to understand. And this one, we want to encourage public transit and something other than cars, but we also recognize that people really like to get in their cars and drive. And we also recognize that we live in New Hampshire, so public transit is pretty limited here. The 14th principle the council adopted was that the surface parking lots should be at the periphery of the downtown, and we don't want them spaced along the way and creating dead zones. And I think that's obviously something the planning board is very aware of as an important planning principle. 15, we should give incentives to residents to use the garage. And 16, and a lot of these really relate to things that the planning board is concerned with, that parking resources should be not just about cars, they should be about bikes and people who are using sidewalks, the whole approach to complete streets that parking resources can enhance. You don't have to have a parking garage with, a 300-foot blank wall. It can be part of the streetscape. And we can accommodate, with our parking resources, bicycles and bump outs and plazas. And then last but not least, since none of us seem to be getting any younger, we need to appreciate the needs of the aging population when it comes to parking. And the last one, which is far more a city council thing, but the parking strategy should be revenue neutral. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rick, and he's going to just hit the highlights of, I think everybody remembers the nice blue cover of the Nelson Nygaard report, and if anybody wants another copy, it's on the web, or we could certainly get you a paper copy. And that really was just taking a look truly at supply and demand downtown. They came, they counted parking spaces, they counted cars, and they gave us mostly data, and now the council's job and EDC and parking traffic safety and planning board is what to do with that data.
Great. Thank you, Cindy.
Okay, this is your second colored handout here on downtown parking supply and demand. And we engaged Nelson Nygaard to look at parking supply and count cars, count occupancy, count parking spaces in a large area around the downtown. And that large orange area on the map here is the total study area that we asked them to look at. And we did this larger area outside the downtown because we wanted to get a sense of spillover from the downtown into neighborhoods, and also because there's some significant facilities like the Parrott Avenue lot and the South Mill lot and so forth that are outside the defined limits of the downtown overlay district. The downtown overlay district is that area in purple on the map, and that's an important area. And the area that Nelson Nygaard also defined was the green area, which is the area within a 5-minute walk from Market Square. And 5 minutes is kind of a benchmark for what you'd like to provide opportunities for people to park and easily get to a downtown business or office or restaurant. And one of the things they did that was very interesting, if you were at the presentation, going through and it's maybe not quite as clear on this slide, but you can see it in your handout, they looked at each facility, each set of on-street parking spaces, each off-street parking lot, private lots as well as public lots, and assigned them essentially here a color based on what percentage of occupancy they were at various parts of the day. And the key here is that if the facility is in a light gray, it's less than 60% occupied, so it's pretty open. If it's a blue, it's 60 to 80% occupied. If it's green, it's 80 to 90%? Yeah. And then I can't read it, but I think that's what it says. And then the pink is getting over 90%, and the red is over 100%. And how can the facility be over 100%, you may ask? And that's because with pay and display meters, somebody can pull into a space, buy some time, leave before their time has expired, and somebody immediately pulls in and takes over their space and buys that time for a second time. So people are double paying for the spaces, and you'll see a lot of that as it goes along. And in these maps, there are areas that are highlighted in red dotted lines. And those are the areas where there's quite a bit of pressure at that particular time. So we start on a weekday, and this is in October, so this is not peak parking time for the city. We start on a weekday at noon, and you see already there are in the core of the downtown, the major streets, all the on-street spaces are getting close to over 100% capacity, and the Parrott Avenue lot is up there close to 100%. Various lots around the downtown. Oh, bigger version. Thank you. Much better. Yeah, so you've got a lot of heavy occupancy. The Parrott Avenue is heavily occupied, and even some of the on-street spaces around the periphery of the downtown. There are spaces coming down State and State Street and some of the other side streets that are close to or over capacity. As we move into the later into the day, that red area, that red boundary that is the intensely used spaces expands to include essentially the entire area within a 5-minute walk from Market Square, except for the parking garage, which stays at a low level of occupancy at that point. And there are other areas outside the downtown that also become more stressed. Let's see, do I have these out of order here? I think you gave them to me out of order. Yeah, or there's pages missing. You're trying to confuse me. Anyway, we can watch this grow, and you can see that the areas here in this case where we're at, this is actually a Saturday afternoon, you can see the entire area of the downtown is really packed. And even the garage and some other lots start to get more heavily in used. And then you get to Saturday, 8 p.m., and it's even more so. And one of the things that is kind of a key finding here, this is looking at the on-street and off-street spaces and the 5-minute walk from the downtown. And you can see the black are the occupied spaces, the white are the unoccupied spaces in these various facilities. And you can see that the utilization of on-street spaces increases throughout the day. It starts down probably a little bit below 50%, but it gets right up there to the 85% mark. And 85% for on-street spaces is the target that you want to not get above. That means that there's at least one space on every block face that's available, so people aren't circling around the block looking for spaces. You never want to get to 100% occupancy for on-street parking spaces, because that just means that you've got total congestion and you've got cars circling looking for spaces. The off-street spaces, however, stay relatively open during the day, but the important thing here is that 35% of those off-street parking spaces are private. 35% of the off-street parking spaces within the 5-minute area are private. So even just looking at the off-street spaces and the amount of vacant spaces doesn't give you a sense of how many spaces are truly available to the general public coming in. This is on Saturday. This is total paid parking, on-street and off-street spaces on a Saturday. And you can see that by Saturday evening, we're totally full. All the paid parking spaces are full. And even in the surrounding area, the upper graph here is the 5-minute walk. The lower graph is that orange area that was outside the 5-minute walk area, and even there you're getting up to capacity on Saturday evening. So clearly, in terms of the spaces that we offer to the public, we're at or exceeding capacity.
And Rick, this again is October, correct?
This is October. Yes, good point. Okay, keep that in mind. I'll get a little bit into that a little bit further on. In this map, the blue spaces represent the private parking lots, and the green spaces represent the public parking lots. And you can see, again, how it's dominated by the private parking lots. Private parking lots represent 62% of all spaces in the entire study area. So the edge of the blue is about what the whole study area is. And they represent 35%, as I said before, of the off-street parking spaces within a 5-minute walk from Market Square. So as you get further from the core, you get more and more private spaces. So the green ones are really the ones, the off-street lots that are available to the general public. Of course, as you know, a lot of these private lots are used informally by the public in the evenings, bank lots and so forth. But in terms of what we actually have under our control to manage, you're basically looking at the green lots. This one, I think, is an interesting chart. This is showing all of our off-street parking facilities. The one on the left, obviously, is the garage, being the largest one. And they're all sorted by the size of the lot, size of the facility. So, and actually, one of them is going to disappear pretty soon, the Port Walk one, which is the second to the left, the one with the most vacancy, weekdays at noon as a percentage, is going to disappear. So this is going to look quite different in the future. But as you can see, the Parrott Avenue lot, as you all know, is packed full at weekday at noontime. There's space in the garage. There was space at Port Walk, and in the Worth lot. Interesting. That number surprised us all. We actually had them go back and check it because we didn't think there was that much vacancy in the Worth lot at noon. And then at weekday at 8 p.m. it's full. So. It's just interesting to see this chart and where the empty spaces are. And the empty spaces are further away from the downtown. In the evening, the South Mill lot and the Masonic lot are mostly vacant because people don't want to walk that long distance in the dark. Another thing that Nelson Nygaard did is they looked at the land uses. They took all of the buildings and properties in the downtown, looked at the land uses in the building, and came up with an estimated parking demand, how much parking those buildings should demand based on typical downtown shared parking characteristics. And those uses, of course, change during the day. In the evening, it's more residential. In the middle of the day, it's more retail. So you add them all up, and what this area line, it's sort of it's a purple line, and there's another, a light-colored line on top of it. You can just barely see. It comes down like this, and then follows down, then it becomes more dominated by red as it becomes residential. So this line is the total demand that they would estimate based on the land uses, and then the bars are the actual number of parking spaces that they counted. So what's interesting is that during the daytime, the actual pretty much reflects what you would project. And then what happens in the evening is we have much more of a demand than would be typical for a downtown. And that probably reflects the overlap between the restaurant users coming in and the workers who haven't left for the day yet and the residents who've come home. So that's when you've got your big crunch, and as everybody knows, when you get to those evening hours, that's when we have our biggest crunch. The other thing that's interesting here is the solid line up here is our total capacity of parking spaces. And then we look at the 85% that I was mentioning before. We don't want to be over 85%. We don't want to have people circling around. So that's really the top of the blue line there. And so in October, not peak season, our estimated excess capacity is 270 parking spaces. That's what it means. Out of all the parking spaces that we have, the 2,400 parking spaces that we have, really what we have is excess parking capacity is on a non-peak time day is the 270 spaces. When you look at, we take these numbers and then you say, what if we take all the vacant space, the empty offices upstairs that aren't filled, the storefronts that aren't filled, and also add in some developments we know about, Port Walk, 30 Maplewood, etc., 233 Vaughn Street. We had about a half a dozen developments we added in. What happens then is that the excess capacity shrinks down to 108 spaces. Again, this is the excess capacity we have, so it's practically nothing. Looking at the percentage there, it's practically nothing. And again, this is only in the off-peak period. And here is kind of an indication of the difference between peak and off-peak. These are the number of times in a month that the High Hanover garage is at capacity. And we were having, Nelson Nygaard was looking in October down here, and in July and August, as you know, it hits peak a lot more often. So that's why it's important to keep in mind the point that Nancy raised about the October versus summertime. There's another way to look at it here. These are the pay and display ticket sales. The difference between October here and July, August here isn't that much, but there still is something of an increase there. And so what happens probably is you get here in July and August, and then you're pushing people into the garage, and that's why the garage starts hitting capacity. We took those numbers, that comparison between the October and the July, August, and tried to project it out. And under existing conditions, the red here, this is the 270 parking spaces of excess capacity that we have right now. We're projecting that even with no growth in the downtown, with no filling of vacancies or anything, by the time you get to July and August, your excess capacity has dropped down to 137 spaces. So that's, this is all trying to get a sense of how squeezed we are. So the summary is, we're running out of parking spaces, and we don't have a lot of capacity for growth. And so that's part of where the council is going with the discussing increasing supply, discussing pricing strategies to better manage supply. And the part that we have is the regulatory changes. So we've talked about this before on a number of occasions about how we address parking in our zoning. It has, with some recent situations, and you may have read about the Kilwins situation and Rudy's, the expansion of these restaurants downtown that are just having so much trouble. They have to go to the zoning board every time they want to add another 600 square feet to their restaurant space. It's just become very problematic, and we've continued to think that the process that we have now just isn't working well. It's very difficult to explain. We tried to make it a lot simpler when we did the zoning ordinance revision, but it still is hard to explain to somebody that if you're converting your space from a store to a restaurant, you have to pay $20,000, or whatever the amount is. So we are now recommending something we've talked about in the past, which is to eliminate that difference between restaurants and other non-residential uses. And as was stated in the parking principles at the very beginning, to consider that the city is responsible for providing parking spaces for the office, restaurant, retail, all those non-residential uses, and that the private sector should be responsible for providing the parking spaces to serve the residences. And so what we have here, and you have it as the very last slide in your table, the proposed changes. Right now, we require one parking space for every 100 square feet of restaurant space. We're proposing that that be eliminated, that there be no requirement for that. There's no change in other ground floor uses. Right now, we require one space per 1,000 square feet for upper floor uses, and we're proposing to, again, to eliminate that requirement for non-residential uses and to go back to the residential requirement of the general multifamily requirement of 1.5 spaces per dwelling unit for residential uses. And those are big changes. Another really big change is to eliminate the payment in lieu. Right now we have $2,200 per space, and you can essentially buy your way out of providing the parking. And as we've discussed in the past, that doesn't buy you a public parking space. 3 times that doesn't buy you a public parking space. That's less than 1/10 of the cost of providing a parking space. We're basically saying that residential users should provide their parking on site and as new development occurs. And we think this will make things much simpler, much easier to understand. The last package that you have shows how we would do that. It's the text package, and basically it's crossing out a lot of stuff. In the last 2 pages, it's just eliminating text. And so we're basically eliminating the optional payment in lieu of providing required off-street parking spaces, and basically saying that residential uses require 1.5 space per dwelling unit, and non-residential uses have no parking requirement. And that's basically what we're asking you to discuss tonight and give us your feedback on. That's it.
Thank you, Rick.
Yep.
Yes, John.
Chairman, it almost seems kind of like a no-brainer here, since one of your principles is for restaurants, for example, that parking for retail, restaurant, and office users is primarily a city responsibility. So I guess that there goes your one space per 100.
Yeah.
So
I guess it's the principle that it does support the principle. I guess maybe since you've all been talking about parking for so long, it's kind of an anticlimax. But I guess we want to make sure that how you feel, whether you think this is going to work, whether you think this is an appropriate way for us to go.
Follow up, having done this, this kind of drives us towards building a parking garage.
Right.
It does. Yep.
And is that? We're not here to discuss that this evening, I know, but.
No, but I think, one of the things, and hold on. I do think it's, I didn't mean to interrupt you, Cindy. I do think it's important that rather than having, one of the meetings, it hit me that, you're going to have little pod parking spaces popping up, and we don't want that. Right. Let's do one municipally controlled parking garage. That frees other space to be developed, parks, buildings, office, revitalization, rather than having these, you saw all the little private lots, and they're all over the place. So for me, I think this is long overdue. I think the revenues that developers will, I'll say save, I think will go back into filling storefronts and building new buildings and generating revenue for the city through the parking garage. So, yes, Cindy, sorry.
Well, I was going to say, John, that the whole point of doing this and that the little boxes flow chart at the beginning, where it needs to be comprehensive, because we can't, only the city council decides whether it wants to bond and build a garage, but the council needs to hear from this board that this is where we want to head, so these things aren't going to get passed in a vacuum. The council isn't going to, do 3 readings later this month saying, oh yeah, we'll get rid of the parking requirement if the planning board wants that, and we'll get rid of the payment in lieu. they're not going to go ahead with that until they decide what they want to do with the garage, and they're going to look at it comprehensively. So that's why this is so important, because it's always been, or for quite some time, it's been chicken or the egg. And my feeling on why it's the recommendations that Rick had up there are important is that what we've been doing really hasn't been working. We generate a little bit of revenue, but people always want to do the payment in lieu. I mean, there's not a lot of circumstances where you can build on site. And so we actually have projects where people really ought to have parking on their residential site, but since it's so much cheaper for developers to buy their way out, they can, and then people buy those units and they're mad at the city because they don't have parking downstairs. So we haven't been generating a lot of revenue with it because the fee is so small. And who it really impacts are, for example, Rudy's Restaurant that had this little expansion it wanted to do, and it was going to require 7 spaces?
6 spaces, yeah.
Ish.
Yeah,
Okay,
so
6 or 7
So
spaces.
$7,000, yeah, or
$15,000.
$12,000, $13,000.
$13,000 to do a little restaurant expansion out onto the Congress Street, which is a great thing. We want to see that as an economic development thing. So it was almost counter to, so those are my 2
And it's
cents.
actually restoring the historic front entrance of that restaurant.
Of Jarvis's, right.
Jarvis's, yeah.
Yep.
And I always felt, I don't know if others felt this way, that just targeting the restaurants like that really wasn't fair. You know, other businesses didn't have to do the parking in lieu, and I don't know, I just always felt that it wasn't fair. So I kind of like this.
Yeah.
William?
What's the reasoning for 1.5 space per dwelling units for residential units instead of like having a space per bedroom? I could see almost like a 2-bedroom place needing 3 vehicles. So how does the formula work for 1.5 space?
Well, I guess the simple answer, without much thought, is that's what we have as our multifamily regulation in the rest of the city, is 1.5 space per unit. I guess we didn't really want to get into as much, into regulating, because you get these things where, well, is this a den or is this a bedroom, and people kind of play those games. And I think we just felt that if you had, basically for if you had one dwelling unit, you're going to end up with 2 spaces. If you have 2 dwelling units, you're going to end up with 3. We at least want to have a minimum requirement of parking on site without getting into the details. We know there's a 5,000 square foot dwelling unit that's being built. It's going to be built as part of that 233 Vaughan Street development. It could be just one person, even though it's a huge unit. We don't know who's going to live there and how they're going to occupy it. So if a couple moves in, wants to have a huge condominium, and they're not going to have necessarily 5 cars. So I guess it was kind of, try as a management thing really more than anything else, trying to make it simple.
Okay, thank you.
And one interesting thing is that under our current ordinance, that 5,000 square foot unit is required to have 5 parking spaces, which that kind of just calls into question what we're doing right now.
But no, I've said it before. I think this is simple. I think it's long overdue. I think it's needed. And I know there was a revenue neutral is their position on this, which I think is great, but it's simple. I just think it's a way to go. So,
I think
yes, John.
from a value standpoint as well, if we're not kind of leaning on developers when they do residential units to provide parking, you're going to end up with a lot of with units that don't have parking, whose value will plummet, which doesn't help the current profession in which I work, and which I've had firsthand experience trying to sell. So boots on the ground type of experience. You see how people react to property, and you see people putting a lot of money and a lot of accoutrements into things, and no matter what they put in, no matter how stainless the appliances are, no matter how much Kohler fixtures are there, it doesn't help the value at all if there's no parking.
Kohler's a great fixture, too.
Yes. The check's in the mail.
Councilman Nutley, table.
Thank you, John. This doesn't prevent a developer, let's say a condo downtown that needs 2 spaces. If you can't find the space right there at the unit, you could do it in the garage, correct?
No.
I mean, you could make a deal with the garage? No?
No,
You
this
can't
this
do that.
requires you to provide the parking spaces on site. Now, if it exempts the first 4 parking spaces. So if you have a very small, single or 2-family house in the edge of the downtown, it's not going to force you to provide those parking spaces, but it does require you to provide them on site. And so, for example, the development that's before us on Bridge Street would be problematic under the zoning.
Because there's no place to
Because
find the space.
because they're
on
building,
site.
they're maximizing the building on the site. They would have to reduce the size of the development in order to provide space for parking.
And/or go underground.
Or go underground, yep, right.
What forces that underground?
Yep.
Is it possible to build underground there at that particular site? It is, okay. I guess I just feel badly if somebody wants to develop something and they can't go underground and there's absolutely no place to put parking.
Well, there's always the Board of Adjustment. Yeah, they
Okay.
can always apply
Okay, I
for a
see what you're
variance.
saying.
Or change the use of the building.
Yep.
I mean, it's almost calling for you to say, you got to do something else
I
here.
see, okay.
You know, I mean,
Yeah.
I'm not telling you what to do,
Not
but
telling
sometimes
you,
you're
yep.
being told what you can't do, so Cindy?
And I think it will, we're all interested in that nice mix of non-residential and residential downtown. And you could make the argument that residential hasn't really been paying its full freight if it's not building parking on site, and it's relying on the public sector to provide that parking. If you build a development that's right near the garage, you sell those units for a lot of money, and you say, oh yeah, you can go park in the public garage. Well, they may do a more mixed-use building if they can't build the residential on site. So, that may tilt in a direction so that we're not headed towards a homogeneous residential downtown with a few retail and office tucked in.
Yeah. It's hard to go, once you go retail, it's hard to go back. It is, I mean.
Yeah.
Yes, Paige?
I guess I feel like this makes good sense. I don't have a lot of comments. I guess the thing that jumped out was just thinking about any unintended consequences like this issue of the residential. I'm thinking of the couple of times when I was on the Historic District Commission and we were faced with buildings that they wanted to put parking right on the ground level, those kind of issues, right at the street.
Thank you for reminding me. One of the things, right in the downtown overlay district, we have this prohibition against first ground floor, we have prohibition against ground floor residential, and we also have a requirement that parking spaces not be within a certain distance of the street. They have to be set back a distance. One of the things that we're going to need to look at with this, I think also, and we haven't actually incorporated in this, is potentially expanding the downtown overlay district. Right. There are spaces below Penhallow Street, between Penhallow Street and the garage and the bridge. The bridge is not there right now, but the bridge will be back, that are not in the downtown overlay district, and those are areas where we would, we want to make sure that those areas benefit from these rules. We don't want to be forcing them into a situation that they don't need to be forced into. And there may be other areas just around the fringe of the downtown that we may want to include in that. And that's a reminder that we need to come back with a proposal for that as well.
That's good.
Interesting, so. I think, in general, I think everybody's supportive of, and I'll say it a third time, I think it's the panacea. I think it's a great idea.
Well, we've had this workshop session. There's a work session, a joint work session of the Economic Development Commission and the Parking and Traffic Safety Committee on April 6th. And I think after that, staff will probably regroup and see, we will obviously bring the planning board's consensus back to the city manager, and he will have been involved in another discussion as well. And at that point, we will probably very likely schedule add to the agenda in April, formal consideration of this change, because this is just a work session. There's no vote required tonight, but we will probably bring that back and possibly bring a map change back in terms of the downtown overlay district. And so don't be surprised if on the April agenda you see something that would carry this to the next step and then send it on to the city council, the recommendation.
Good. Yes, Cindy.
And then what you'll see, if the planning board acts next month to make that recommendation to the council will hold on to that planning board piece as they develop the bigger part of the, we're one piece of the puzzle, so it's not like they'll go right to first reading. I don't think they'll put all the pieces of the puzzle together and then bring them through as one omnibus so that they're acting on the whole of the recommendations from both planning board and others, not just the planning board. So I think that's what we could expect to see.
Yep, great. Any other comments? Monday night, we have a joint work session with the council, EDC, HDC. I think there'll be a presentation, then we'll split up into groups of, there'll be a planning board member with EDC, HDC, and council. When the meeting's done, I think the following month, the first 15 minutes of our agenda, we're just going to go over what you liked, what you didn't like. So if, when you leave Monday night's meeting, you want to think, or the next week, just write down what you liked and didn't like, and then I think we'll get that back to the mayor to see if it was a positive experience, what could we change, what could we not. So you'll see that on the agenda for April as well. And I believe that's 6:30?
6:30 at the high school.
At the Little Theater.
Little Theater,
So the
yes.
right-hand side, near the ball fields, if you go in that entrance, it's kind of, take a right, and it's right in the back there, so.
They'll put up signs,
Yeah.
I'm sure.
Yep.
We'll hope that it's not a beautiful evening.
There's not a bunch of games going
We've had
on.
our share of that, so do you have any other comments? Can we have a call for adjournment?
Can I just
Oh,
ask
yes.
one thing? Are we going to talk about the parking garage at some point? The planning board? I mean, will this board talk about it?
I don't know as we will. I think that's more of a council
Okay.
issue.
Yeah.
I think we present the data that says there's a need. Here's some changes we support. And I think at that point, the council needs to look and say, there's a need, here's what we'd like to do, and hopefully that'll foster that discussion at the council level. Yes, Cindy?
And it may be when we pass on to the council, give our report in on the regulatory, on the zoning changes, that we may want to say some of our own little principles, like, it's the planning board's belief, if in fact it is, that the system in place hasn't been working because, some of the things we talked about tonight, that what we have been doing hasn't worked. It's been hard on the little guy who's trying to expand, and it's not creating more supply where it needs to be created.
And maybe we could even attend that council meeting, just, if need be, just to present. If there's any Q&A we could answer, so they could see it from our perspective. I know there's a lot of former planning board members, but some of them seem to forget, so we need to remind them. So, are there any other comments or questions? So, do I have a call for adjournment?
So moved.
Thank you. Good night.